WP-Get Web Dev Tutorials for all user levels. Hey guys, so today's discussion just around getting ready for Elementor Flexbox containers being production. Still hopeful. Still seems to be taking a while. I'm not sure when they're going to release it, but I want to be ready for when they are. So I like to start sites with a starter site, which helps me to define all of my fonts and colors and styling. I then clone that out for new sites, and that gives me a starting point. I just wanted to show you where I'm up to with this. I'll show you the code that I use, but I'm not sharing the code per se. It's more of a concept on what you can do, and this is going to vary a lot for me over the next probably week or two. So there's no point in sharing the code, which is going to change in the short term. So what I start with is a home page. It's got a heading saying colors. I've got my primary, secondary and accent color, and then I have a variation on each of those, and then I've got 5 different levels of grey. So these are my colors, and I can control those using the globals in Elementor. Typography, I create, apart from your standard fonts that you have in your globals, I create a few. One is the extra large, normal, bold and thin, medium, bold, normal and thin, small bold and extra small bold. Accent's just one of the defaults. Okay, so these are just font definitions. They don't give you colors, they just give you the sizes at the different breakpoints, all that sort of stuff. So that's all I'm defining there. By the way, I'm just using Poppins as my default, and I'll change that if I'm going to change it on a site. All right, so then this section here is actual heading 1, an actual heading 2, an actual heading 3, and an actual heading 4. I've just put the 4 here. I normally define 4 or 5. Quite often the number 5 would actually be the same as the accent up here. Now the beauty of doing this is that these headings are actual heading tags, but they can be any one of these. So if I want my heading 1 to be a medium bold, I'll just set my heading 1 to medium bold. If I want it to be medium normal, set to medium normal. If I want it to be extra large thin, I can set it to that. So the semantics of HTML heading ordering doesn't matter. You still want the ordering to be heading 1, heading 2, heading 3, etc. But the actual look of it you can change by just setting it to any of these predefined fonts that you've got up here. So that's the concept of it. I've then just got some body copy. Again, it's all Poppins. Now I've got some text editor widgets here, and what I'm showing here, and I'll show you the code I've got for this, is all I do is add a toPrimary class to the text widget, and then anything I wrap in a mark tag will be converted to the primary color. Same with the variations and the secondary and accents here. I've then got an example here of another text box where there's no class applied to the text box, but in the markup itself, so in the text that I put inside the text box, if you go to the, not the visual, but the text tab, and you wrap any text or anything inside a mark and then set the class to primary, to secondary, to accent, etc., the same as up here, then it will only affect that. So doing it this way, you might have a text box where you have some of the text you want to be colored in primary, some secondary, some in accent. Instead of setting the class on the text box, you would wrap the text that you want in a mark and add the class to that. So hopefully that makes sense. So I'll just show you what I mean if I look at the markup for that. So if I look at this to secondary here, I'm just zooming in so you can see. So there's my paragraph there, and I've got a mark, a class to secondary, and I've just got some text in here which actually says the text that we've actually got there, and because that's wrapped inside this to secondary, it's going to change it to the secondary color. Okay, so that's that. Underlines and overlines. So I've defined a bunch of classes for underlines and overlines. So any heading element or any element that you like to put an underline on, we just add the underline class to it, and that'll give us this 4 pixel high black underline that goes 100% of the width of its element. We are using the block element modifier syntax for naming of classes. So the 2 dashes mean it's a modifier. So to get a underline primary, we add the underline class and the underline dash dash primary class, so the underline class gives us all the properties to get the underline. The dash dash primary just changes the color. So that's how that works. If I just quickly look at one of those and have a look at the actual element, so I can see there I've got underline and underline primary, or underline dash dash primary, and that gives me my underline with the primary color. So I've got those for each of the colors and variations. I then have these ones here I've called underline primary gradient, and what that's doing is it's changing the gradient. So when we add the underline primary gradient, it adds a linear gradient on the background from the primary color through to black fully transparent, and we do that for each of the classes that we've got. I've just done primary, secondary, and accent. You can do that for the others as well. And this is a starting point. This is the point I want to make. This is actually a starting point, and then you would add or change your styles to suit. Overlines, same deal. We just add an overline class to this is a H4 element, I believe. And if you want it to be primary, you add overline and overline dash dash primary. Now, these ones over here are a bit more tricky. So if I have a look at this one here, I've got my content height and width is a variable. So accent line height, accent line width, and we've also got, if we have a look at the H4 above that, we've got a line items. There's accent line items, line items I should say. So the idea there is that if we go to this, that's the widget there for the heading. So I've set a style attribute for accent line height being 8 pixels, line width being 25 pixels, and line items to flex start. So that sticks it at 25% wide, 8 pixels high, align it to the left. Let's have a look at this one here. So if we have a look at that one there, I'm telling that with attributes, so my style accent line height to 14 pixels, the line width to 40%, and the line items to the flex end. So that's 40% of the width, align to the end, and 14 pixels high. So that's pretty much really just have to add an attribute to override those properties. And also I've got a border radius of, I think a default of, let me have a look at that. You can't tell from here. I think it defaults to 60 pixels, which will basically round anything that's, if it's not a square, by setting the pixels to higher than what you've actually got, it actually has a weird effect of actually giving you a properly rounded edge. So that's pretty much what we do to override those. We then have block markers, where again, this is a heading 4. If we just add block marker to it, it just puts a black marker behind it. If we add block marker and block marker dash dash primary, it does a block marker and then makes it the primary color. Here's the other colors. We're overriding the radius, which is by default 0, by setting the style for the block marker border radius. I think I set it to 8 pixels on this. And on this one, we're overriding the border radius, and we're also setting the rotation, block marker rotation. We should tidy this up because that doesn't look like it's part of it. Where on each of these I'm just making, I think went 2, 4, 6, 8 for the rotation, so you can rotate your markers. So that's just by adding a style attribute. Forms, all I've got on here is some custom CSS, which for my required fields, it just puts a marker on the left hand side, and by default it's using my secondary color, I think, which we can change. Buttons, got our standard Elementor buttons, so through the Elementor global settings, when you set your button styles, that's your button. Unfortunately in Elementor there is no provision for additional buttons or multiple button styles. So what I've done is created some CSS where we add button dash dash alt to that, and we get an alternate button where what this one's doing is giving us our secondary color as the non-hovered state and leaving it as our accent color for the hovered state. And then we've got another class which is button --alt2, which gives us this button here, which is a transparent background, black text, and a primary colored border with a border radius on the edge. Roll over and it goes to black with white text. So we're basically, that's the starting point. So for this, what I then do is in my Elementor, if I want to change my primary color, all I have to do is go into my site settings and in my global colors, and here's my primary. I'm just going to copy that because I don't really want to change that. I'll change that. Let's make it actually a bluish color. So make it this kind of greenish blue, like a what I call it, cyan color. So I'm going to grab that and I'm going to put that in my primary variation, and then I'm going to change that color. So you can see them colors changing here. So let's make it that sort of desaturated version of that for now. Update that. Back to the editor. Okay, so you can see my primary colors there, that underlines changed there. My primary colors changed there, it's changed in my marks. It's changed on these underlines here. There's my heading 3, I think I've got set to the primary color. It's changed on the blocks. So this is a really good way of having content ready so that when you set your colors, it's obvious what you're going to get throughout. You can then move this page somewhere else or delete it or use this as a reference page. But this is a really good way to start by just setting all of your properties. One thing you will notice on these underlines and overlines, for example, is the properties for the height and width and alignment are not visible in the editor. And the reason for that is because these attributes that you set in Elementor, so you set the attributes by setting a style with a pipe and then the overrides there, they don't seem to get transpiled in the editor, only in the front end. So if I look at this in the front end, these all work properly, but in the editor, none of these attributes apply. So from a design perspective, when you're designing this, you just have to look at the effect it has on the front end. I'm not sure if this is going to be something Elementor is going to improve in the newer versions, but in the current version of 3.7 point whatever it is, that's just how it is. Okay, so that's what we're achieved as our starter. All right, now a few things I'm going to note in here is if you look at the top section, and I'm actually using semantic HTML, so my header is a heading element, my sections are section elements. Okay, so I don't want them to be just a div or a span or whatever. I want them to be actual proper semantic HTML. So what I've done here is, if you have a look at my styling here, so from the top of the word colors to where the header starts, there's a spacing. It's about the same amount of spacing there. I don't know if you can see this in the video, but I've got a slight grey background on the second section here, but the spacing between the start of that section to the top there and the start of that to the text there is the same spacing. Same as these ones here, same there, and then right to the bottom, that's the same spacing at the bottom. So that's easy enough to do, but what I found was that in the cases where, for example, I've got a absolutely positioned header here because I like the option to have, say, a background image that's showing through and not have my content set up underneath the header without manually having to add padding to every page that's got the absolutely positioned header. So what I've done here is a little bit tricky, and I'm going to show you in the actual editor first. So if we go to our top section, which is our colors, and have a look at our advanced tab, I've got, it's a section standard -- header clearance. Okay, so my modifier, so the dash dash is your BEM or block element modifier. The dash dash is your modifier. So it's a standard section or section standard with a header clearance modifier. If I look at my topography section, all I've got on there is section standard. So I just want the standard spacing on that one. So let's see how that actually works in the SCSS. So if we look at my layout SCSS, what I'm doing here is I'm making sure it's a section. So I want to make sure that none of this applies unless I've made it a section. So sorry, just go back there. So when we go to our colors and our layout and the additional options, make sure your HTML tag is a section. If we forget and we leave that on a div, none of our styles are going to apply to it. Okay? Because I want to make sure that we've actually made this a section so it's semantically correct. So section standard, we want to set the padding top to our variable responsive spacing for Excel, which I'll talk about shortly. Same with the bottom. So the top and the bottom padding is exactly the same. But SCSS, so that's our top level rule, appending header clearance, so dash dash header clearance, so it'd be section dash standard dash dash header clearance. We're going to take the header height as being the desktop height, which we measure. I'll come back to that. And then if we're less than 768 pixels or maximum width of 767 pixels, I want the header height to be our header height mobile. Okay. And we're going to set the padding bottom to exactly the same as what we did up here. Actually, I don't probably need to do that because it's already set. So I'll take that out so there's no confusion, because the only thing we're going to change is the padding top. We're going to calculate the header height plus the spacing. So without the clearance, it's just the spacing. With the clearance, we're going to calculate the header height and the spacing. All right, to set the header heights, I've got my utilities class here, and in here, I've got two variables. One is heading height desktop, and the other one is heading height mobile. So how I find those is bring out my Chrome DevTools, have a look at my header, select my header, my computed styles, 60, 70, 80. So 60 height and 10 padding. So my actual full height is 70. When I go to mobile, have a look at that header, I've got 52, 50, 60, 70. Okay, or 72. So once you get those values there, just punch those in to here. Actually, it's a little different to what was last time, I'm not sure why. Maybe it's because of my zoom. I think I'm zoomed in a little bit. Interesting. So I've got 60, 70, 80. Well, that's interesting. So when I scrolled and scrolled back, I get a different number. So I've now got 46, 56, 66. That's a weird one. Let's do Control F5. Okay, so hit my header. So this tells me it's 60, 70, 80. So if I scroll back, it's now telling me 46. Okay, so that changes from 60 to 46. I'm not sure what's happening with Chrome. It's not presenting that properly. So the actual value I want is once we've scrolled, what is that? So I've got 46, 56, 66 on my desktop, and that's the value that I would put into here. 66 on the desktop, mobile, F5. So if I scroll back, my header, I've got 35, 45, 55. So I've got 66 and 55. Okay. All right, so that's, save that. So my layout. So that's my heading section, my section standard and my section standard dash dash header clearance. So the rest of the sections will just have, if I look at my topography section, all I've got is section standard. So that's just going to give me my spacing, responsive, Excel, top and bottom. All right. So what happens with that, and I am spending a bit of time on this because this is an important one for me. If I look at my responsive there, and I go to a section, so I've got this section here. I can see my padding top and padding bottom is 80. If I scroll down, I get below 1024, I think it is. Now I've got 64 top and bottom. Keep scrolling down, and I've got 48 top and bottom. So I'm reducing the padding top and bottom as the size of the screen drops below the breakpoints. So my thinking is that the smaller your screen is, the less padding we want on the top and the bottom. It just works for me, so that's the way I'm doing it. Now, I went through this in another video, so I won't spend too much time on this, but just very quickly, in my utility CSS, I've got my base units, I've got my mobile font size scale, my tablet font size scale, mobile spacing scale, so I can change the scaling of my fonts or my spacing separately, set my base sizes. This is the R for so font size responsive, FSR, and then my spacing responsive, XS through to XL. When it's on a tablet, recalculate that using the tablet scale for both the font size and the spacing, and on the mobile, recalculate the font size and spacing for the mobile scale. So that's pretty much what that is. And I won't go through all this because I've been through that in the previous videos, mapping my Elementor globals through to actual usable, readable variables. So in my, so that's all my layout there. I'm not going to go into too much more of this. Sticky header. Now, what I used to do is with my sticky headers, I used to put the code in the header. So I used to get the container, and in the advanced custom CSS, I put it in here and used to select the keyword and then put all my stuff in there for the sticky header. I don't do that anymore. I pull it out and I stick it into my code box here, so it's all done in the same place. So we need to make it a little bit more specific because Elementor will override these, so we want to make it as specific as possible to stop that overriding. So we can absolutely position header, top and left, 100% width. We've got a very small box shadow that I'll put on here. So that is the, when we're not scrolled, see it's got a very slight line there, it's a slightly shadowed line. And as we scroll, that goes into a much bigger shadow that looks like it's more stood off the page. So, very small box shadow. The site logo, now remembering with Elementor, when you add things to the editor, you don't just add an element, it adds the widget as a div, it adds a div for the widget wrapper, and then it adds the actual element you want. So we've got to target the element we want. So when under this header standard, we're looking for the Elementor widget theme logo, and in my case I'm setting it to a maximum of 200 pixels, which gives me, so when I'm scrolled out, that's maximum 200 pixels wide up here. And then when the sticky effects is applied to the element, we want a bigger box shadow with a bit of transparency in the black, and we want the max width of the site logo to be 100 pixels. So as I scroll, it scrolls down to 100 pixels, and it takes 1 second to do it. So you can change all of those properties right here. Okay, and Elementor adds a on the containers, it adds the overlay on the before pseudo element. So all we're doing is telling it to set the opacity of that to 1 and give us a background color of white with some opacity, and that gives us this bit of opacity, so as we scroll through you can just see the background through the header. Okay, so that's the layout stuff. Now the typography, now this is a little bit flasher. I won't go through these. These are an old way I used to do things, which is forcing colors. But what you'll see here is in my variables, I'm referring to colors as color primary variation, color secondary variation, accent line height items. I'm not referring to what you would normally get. Now, let's have a look at one of these colors with the Elementor colors. Okay. So in Elementor, apart from your primary, secondary, text, and accent, you get these random strings for your global colors. So that would be my primary variation, that one there, the 8BCCFF3. I don't want to have to refer to these colours by that, so I'd rather call them colour primary variation like that. And that's what all that mapping was about over in the utilities here, which I've done in a previous video, so I'm not going to go through that again today. But this maps all of those variables to actual readable variables. So I can refer to this colour here as my colour primary variation, this colour here as my colour secondary variation, etc. And this is the SCSS that does all that. All right, so now that's that. What else was there? It's like I've messed something up here because I've lost my spacing down the bottom here, so I have to come back to that. Oh, I know what I did. I took it out of that rule for my layouts. Took my padding top, so section standard, padding bottom. Maybe I didn't add the section standard as well. That's right. So over here in the editor, let's get back out of there. So I'm forgetting my BEM naming convention. So if I go to my colours here, section, what's going on here? Decided to go on a bit of a go slow. I only added the section standard dash header clearance, which is the modifier. I didn't add the root class, so this won't apply because the actual class I added was this plus that. So I can do this in a couple of ways. Because I've only got one extra property on here, I can actually just add this padding bottom to that rule there. But we want to keep this as a standard. So I want to use the block element modifiers. I'm going to use the block as section standard. I'm going to add that. So on my class list here now, might be a bit hard to see, I've got section standard, which gives me my top and bottom padding, and then I've got my section standard with the modifier header clearance, which gives me my override. So I'm just going to update that and just check that that's correct now. Okay, so now I've got the proper spacing at the bottom, and I've got the extra spacing at the top to clear the transparent header. All right, so that's those. Now, I did mention the overlines, markers, exactly the same deal. I've just added the block primary marker. In my blocks, I've just added the attribute for the border radius and for the rotation. Forms, my buttons. I was going to show you the buttons. So I've put forms and buttons under one SCSS. So here's the CSS here to create these markers here on anything that's required. So anything that's got a required field, add this little marker on the left hand side here, because Elementor forms don't have a marker indicator for required fields. So this is just a field, an extra to do that. Buttons. So the first button, as I said, is a standard Elementor button. We define it in the global settings. There is no alt button or second alt button. Sometimes we want a couple of different variations of buttons. So the way I've done that, I've created a root class called button. If it's got dash dash alt, so button dash dash alt, we want the background color to be our secondary color. So by adding button dash dash alt on there, we're taking our standard button, we've made the non-hover state the secondary color, leaving the hover state as the accent color. Bit hard to see because they're pretty close on this one. On my dash dash alt 2, so button dash dash alt 2, I've set the background to transparent, the color of the text to black, put a border on it using my primary color. Again, I don't have to look for the Elementor random strings, I just call it my primary color. Put a border radius of 60 pixels. There's a funny thing in CSS where if you specify percent, it's like 50%, and the element is not square, if it's rectangle, you end up with a weird shape, like a ellipse shape in the border. But if you specify it in pixels, even if you specify more pixels than what you actually have, it seems to round that down and give you a properly rounded edge rather than an ellipse. So that you can set that as high as you like, and it seems to work. Now, and on the hover state, we want the color to go to white and the background color to black. So let's have a look over here. Here's my alt button. So I've got my primary color as a border in the background, transparent background, black text. As I roll my mouse over, I get black background and white text. So all I have to do on a button to make this a standard button here is just a standard button with no styling. Alt button is just an alt button with button -- alt class on it. Alt 2 button is a standard button with button -- alt 2. So you get the picture. A lot of the stuff you can do with an Elementor, there's a lot that you can't do. And I think if we just don't try and put CSS everywhere, like reinstall this button and then copy and paste that and then try and apply that style later to multiple other buttons, keep it really, really clean by keeping it all in the one place. My recommendation is don't stick them in Elementor, don't stick them in your site settings, custom CSS or anywhere else. Put them all in one location. In my case, I'm using WP Codebox, and I've split my entities into SCSS files here, so they're a bit easier to understand, and it just makes it much, much easier to manage. So next one I'm just going to finish off on is this SCSS for redefining the mark. Alright, so you'll notice here on each of these I've got a two primary variation, two secondary variation, etc. And what I've done here is I've got a and no space dot to primary, and I've got a comma, and then I've got a dot to primary space and. Let's have a look what that actually does in the code. So here it is there. So what my SCS compiles to is mark dot to primary and dot to primary space mark. So what that means is that we can add this class to a mark element, or we can add this class to an element above the mark, and it does the same thing. All right, so this is the beauty of using things like SCSS. So just by putting the append and the prepend, so the append is the dot to primary, the prepend is the space, to primary space, we've actually ended up with each of these having both of those properties. So it's a mark with the class, or an element above the mark with the class. And I'll show you what I mean. So if we look at we look at this text box here, and we have a look at the markup for that, all I've done is wrap the word to primary in a mark attribute, and it's got my primary color. If I go down to my to secondary, all I've done is wrapped my to secondary in a mark attribute. How does this work? We go to the advanced and have a look at the CSS classes. We've added to secondary on the widget. So any mark that it finds under that widget, it's going to apply that to secondary class to. So back to here. So to secondary is this one here. So what we've just done is we've added to secondary here to the text box. So any mark it finds after that, it's going to apply the secondary color to it. All right. Let's now look at the next variation of this, which is this text box here, where there is no. Actually, we'll take that. Actually, has got a class on there, which it shouldn't have. Let's take that off. So we've got no CSS class on the text editor widget, but in the content itself, if we have a look at the content, we've got. I love the way Elementor does that. It's just added this extra bloody rubbish in there, which it does sometimes. So let's get rid of all that. Okay. So now we're going to change that to primary. And we're going to make that to primary. Okay, look at this. We've actually got spaces there. In the visual editor it's right, but in this editor it's wrong. I click somewhere else, it's still wrong. I'm not sure how they do this. If you press the enter key and then go backwards, then it fixes it. That's just a bug that's been in this bloody editor for quite some time. Alright, so now what we have is in this editor, we don't have a class on the editor, so we're not specifically targeting every mark that's in there, but in the content itself, we're wrapping got a mark, which we've got the two primary, and they're wrapping this text here inside that mark, which is giving us the primary color. On this one, we've got a mark with two secondary class, and then we're wrapping all this text here inside that mark, and that gives us the secondary. So two different ways of doing it. So the cool thing with SCSS is it's simple as here's my rule, or here's my properties I want to apply, here's my rule, so I want to append to primary and I want to prepend to primary here to give us the same, so to give us the double usage of that rule. Alright, so that's pretty much that. Underlines and overlines, they're all the same kind of thing, where we've just basically created all these rules, again using our color secondary, color accent variation, not random elemental generated variables, and you can still change those within the Elementor UI because they're mapped across to these variable names. Alright, so that's pretty much that. It's a lot to go through, so I didn't expect it to be this long, but doing this kind of preparation gives you a great starting point. So when you want to build a new site, you clone this site across, change your colors, change your fonts, change your sizes, and basically once you've done that, so once you've done that, you end up with this reference page. You can set all your colors, you set your fonts, assign those fonts to heading 1s through to heading 4s, heading 5s if you want. Check your text, your body text, see what your colors look like in text when they're mapped to a mark attribute. See what your underlines and overlines look like. Block markers, what do they look like? Forms, buttons, what do they look like? And then you can change these. So the only caveat is with some of the stuff, like for example the standard button, you can change that through your elemental globals. The alt buttons you have to change through your external CSS or SCSS editor, but it gives you a great starting point. And yeah, so that's pretty much it. So hopefully that is something that inspires you to do something similar, and I look forward to your feedback on that. If you like this kind of thing, subscribe and please hit the like button so I know that this is the kind of thing you want to hear from me. Thank you.